Okay, we're live. If you're watching, my name is Odinaka Isabelle. I'm the host of a twice monthly podcast called Nigerian-ly Speaking, where we talk about all things policy and Nigeria. I'm joined today by a friend of mine who's the host of a podcast, A Policy Brief with Eramasele. And today we plan to talk about sovereign debts, what's going on the African continent. So I just hope you listen and enjoy yourself on this Friday night. Eroms.
All right. Enke, thank you so much for setting this up. Thank you so much for having me. I really just want to come and have a conversation with you about the topic that we're going to be discussing. Nothing too academic. We're just two people that love policy that want to come and share our shared passions with everybody else, especially with how important policy is in the sense that it shapes our lives in a very subtle way. So you can go ahead and introduce the topic and we'll take it up from there.
So today we're talking about that. As you've seen in different countries around Africa, there's been a lot of talk about like restructuring, economic restructuring. We saw the protest in Kenya because of the new finance bill. And we saw that there was a thread in all that was going on and the debt profile of African countries. So we thought it was important to come and talk about debt today and just what that continuum is and how countries find themselves indebted and then in distress and having to go to the IMF for reprieve. Yes. So yes, Aroms, what do you have to say?
So I think, just for me, I just take a step back, look at the topic, right? The African debt story, debt distress or crisis, even though there's subtle differences. The question is, how did we get here? Because if we're saying it's a story, how did we get from, thinking about this, you can't discount the fact that the African continent was colonized not too long ago. So, because I'm just trying to put two and two together in terms of the story. But we did get independence and a lot of hope. This is a different generation from at least my parents' generation, and they had a lot of hope during their time in terms of how things were going to get better. We hear a lot of stories about how people finished school and they got jobs, they bought things for, maybe things that amounts that we consider as very little, right? But it's not the case now. And if you look at what's happening now, the countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Zambia, most of the African countries have debt profiles that are just astronomical. And you have to ask the question, why? So that for me is where I think we should start from. How did we get here? So maybe you can sort of chime in.
Okay, so I would like to take a step back and just talk about what debt is in the first place, right?
Okay.
So by debt, everyone knows debt, of course, in their personal lives, or even if you run a business, you may have taken out a loan, or even you need to pay your children's school fees and you borrow money. So we're all familiar with debt, but the debt we're talking about in this case is like sovereign debt, which is debt that's held by countries. And so why? Because many times when these conversations are had, we talk about debt like it's a problem or it's a bad thing. Debt is not necessarily a bad thing. It's how you use the debt.
Yes.
And also how you manage the debt. So why do governments go to debt in the first place? Governments borrow to spend money beyond what they currently have, which they do so that sometimes they don't have to raise taxes. So governments have to spend money on certain things that we expect of them. Whatever kind of government that is, you have an expectation of what your government should be doing for you. And to meet up those demands, they either need to tax to do it or they have to borrow, right? And so that's why governments take on debt in the first place. And so you see that there are many economic motives. For example, when they start taking that, maybe there's a recession, and obviously you can't increase taxes on the average person, so you go and borrow, or you have to do this infrastructure and you borrow to kind of receive some concessionary financing. And we can talk about um, that later during the discussion. And so you find that governments begin to take um, these debts, and they can take various form, right? Because some of these debts are in fact domestic. So they take it from banks in the form of bonds, treasury bills,
They
green
take it
bonds,
from
or
you and I as
whatever.
well, the treasury bills.
Yes, exactly. Promissory notes, or they take it from external parties, right? Multilaterals like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, or bilateral, so from China, from France, from Japan, from India. And there's so many words I'm using, and
When
we
you said
can
China, I
talk
just got that. I
into.
got the tingles. Go ahead.
So, like China, from the Exports Import Bank of China, for example, or from France, from the French Development Agency. So, institution like that is what we call bilateral, or they can take it from multilaterals, where it's like multiple countries put their money in a pool, and then you take out money from that. So that's like the World Bank, African Development Bank. So, and then there's also the commercial forms like, Euro bonds, or other form of syndicated loan. So it's important to really understand what this debt profile is, because sometimes it's not all external. So I hope I've covered that.
Yeah, you did a good job.
Aaron's.
So I think what I would just like to add to that is, whilst we sort of provide a brief, I guess, overall, sort of feel to what debt is, I like to say, where you get your debt and the type of, debt profile you have, it signals different things to, the public, or, to the investor public globally. So if you get your debt internally, if you're owing and you can't necessarily pay, that's not as bad as when you're owing, creditors that are outside your country, right? And that's also still not as bad as when you're owing multinationals like the IMF, right? So there are different levels to
Mm-hmm.
your inability to pay, sovereign debts, depending on the lender category and the implications that has for
Mm-hmm.
your economic prosperity, as would say. So I just wanted to sort of add that in.
Okay, there are different tiers to the sorts of debts
Yes,
that
and whoever
people
you're
take out,
owing
correct?
sort of has a a different implication. So if I'm owing the IMF, I mean, nobody wants to borrow me money now because I'm owing the person that is the lender of last resort. So who am I to,
Mm-hmm.
to give you money and expect my money back, right?
Yeah,
So
and we'll get there, because an IMF loan is a different, historically, an IMF loan is a different kind of loan, right?
yeah,
Because that's an emergency loan. So
type
by
of
the
loan.
time
That's
you're
yeah,
taking, yeah, a loan from the IMF, you're in crisis or you're in distress, and we can talk about that
yeah.
as we continue. But Evans, I'd like to talk to you about like your thoughts on debt and developing countries. Much has been made about particularly countries in Africa going to borrow from all these sources that are not necessarily African, and how those risks are assessed, what kind of interest rates that we get, if they are predatory in the first place, and just talk about the nuances of borrowing as a developing economy, right?
There's just so much to unpack from that your question. It's like, where do I start? Just so much. Well, first of all, given our history, the history of the African continent, like I mentioned colonialism and independence, and the sheer economic hardship that we've had to face. I think you cannot. I think it would be it'd be quite naive to think you would do without debt. Like you said, there's nothing wrong in taking debt. To me, I think the problem is, how do you manage your debt, right? Because if you look at it, the US, I mean, it's almost every, as a Nigerian, it's like almost every market day, right? Because this is why I'm having a conversation. They're talking about their debt ceiling, right? So they're in debt as well, and speaking about, I guess we'll come to it. It's like how debt is perceived on the African continent compared to like other continents like Europe. For instance, Greece had their thing. I don't want to, because I mean, there's the way the media shapes the narrative. They had their thing, but you don't quite seem to hear that much how I put it, staying on the name of Greece when it comes to debt, right? But when you look at countries like Ghana recently and Kenya as they're progressing into it, and even Nigeria as we're having like really crazy debt to GDP ratios, and everybody's screaming from the top of the mountain like what's going on, right? So speaking about predatory, we'll get to that. So for me, I think just to come back to the question, debt I think is necessary given where we are in terms of capital formation, in terms of the depth of our capital market. I think it's extremely necessary. However, I think it's the management of the debt. And I just quickly point to, there's a lovely research that was done. I think by the Frederick, can't pronounce it, but they you just look at the the data, right? So they said the African total external debt amounted to 775 billion USD in 2020. And I think I checked on the IMF website and it was, just hold on. I think it was 800 and something billion dollars about that as at 2022, right? But the 2020 numbers were 775 billion compared to 300 billion USD in 2010. So over a 10-year period from 2010 to 2020, you had, an accumulation of over 300, almost 400 billion US dollars. Now you have to ask the question, yes, the money is increasing, but what are these African countries doing with the money? So so that's why I said it's like, it's something that you can just keep on talking about forever. Maybe not forever, but for a long time. So you're seeing that the aggregate is increasing, but why? And what have we done with the money we've gotten? And you can sort of go down that rabbit hole as to why it's shifting. We would sort of talk about it, I guess. The source of funding from syndicated bank lending to creditors from the capital markets. So we now have better
Okay, I
integration.
almost want
So yes, I
I
get
almost want
it's
to take
complex.
it. I actually want to take a step back and just because you asked the question, what are they doing with the money, right?
Yeah,
There's
really.
this notion that when you take out you need debt to grow, and that when you take out debt, it should be used for some form of an investment. That, in other words, it should be spent on something that will yield
That was for
results in
economic
the
growth.
future,
Yes.
right? And will spur economic growth. So there's always been this tension about what does development look like. So I want to take a step back because there's a tendency to, build infrastructure.
Mm,
Those are the kind of investments you want to make with debt, right? And
yes.
there's also the corruption question, and if every single penny being borrowed is being utilized to the maximum benefits, that's a question. Aside from that, I want to ask a question about like infrastructural spending versus human development in
Mm.
this type spending, like so healthcare, education, and just get your take on development in that sense. Because we've seen like, politicians on the continent, very well meaning. There's this tendency, if you build the biggest, shiniest things,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to bring development. So I would like to ask, like, in terms of what should be the focus of this kind of debt, and what's it being used for?
Wow. It's like, so for me, let me try and stay on topic. I honestly
Hmm.
don't necessarily think, so I think you have to have a healthy balance of infrastructure and human capital. Because if you look at Singapore, right, it was a good mix of both, right? So they invested heavily in Singaporeans. If you notice, I mean, even in my class, we had, I think a few, in my class in Colombia, we had a few people from Singapore, sponsored by the Singaporean government, right? So the founder, I keep forgetting his name. See, he spent, I keep forgetting his name, but I'll remember. So he spent a lot of money in training the human capital of Singaporeans. He sent them abroad, and well, you can sort of ask the
Lee
question.
Kuan Yew?
Yeah, exactly. So he spent money training
Okay.
Singaporeans, in the best schools
Mm-hmm.
in, well, quote unquote, in the West. And they came back and they made sure their country worked. And they also spent a lot of money building infrastructure in Singapore. So you have to have a healthy balance of both. Right. So for me, I don't think it makes sense to say I'm focusing on infrastructure, which seems to be the case in Nigeria, for instance. There's a lot of infrastructure heavy, but then, you try as policy experts to try and divulge yourself from the politics of policy, right? But if you want to go down that
Mm-hmm.
road, because this is a conversation, you find out that there are a lot of elephant projects, there's a lot of stealing. So that's where you find out that, how I put it, debt doesn't necessarily have the impact that it's supposed to have. It's not necessarily a force for good as it should be, right? But for me, I think if you want to be quite analytical about it and truthful about the whole scenario, you want to ensure that you're using debt to build sound institutions in your country, because it's the institutions that will checkmate any excesses in terms of the infrastructure spending or the human capital development or the upscaling of the policies that you have in the country. So for me, I think that's where we need to focus more of, because if you focus on that, then, probably something that we'll talk along the line, looking at the debt management of, public debt management in the country. So looking at the legislation, looking at debt ceilings and things like that. It's the institutions that you build. For instance, in Nigeria, I think we have one of the best in Africa in terms of transparency with the Debt Management Office. All right. And I think that's probably one of the things that spurred this conversation, because they released their reports, right? And in the reports, I think I have something here where they're talking about our debt being about 121 trillion, which amounted to about $91 billion. And everybody was freaking out, like, what's going on? Because now we're in the territory of 50 something percent debt to GDP, right? That's one of the benefits of sound institutions. So
So I need to
it's
take a
complex.
step backwards
Don't
because
take too many steps back, because you've been taking a lot of steps
okay,
back.
so we've been saying this debt to GDP. I think it's crucial we spend some time talking out
Yeah.
and parsing this issue, which is debt to GDP versus debt to revenue.
Mm.
So you have countries who have debt to GDP of 300% and are well
Mm-hmm.
performing. Debt to GDP the real issue, or is it your ability to pay the debt? And then speaking of that, like especially when we start talking about ability to pay the debt and the interest rates in the first place, what
Mm.
makes debt so expensive for African countries and some of these developing countries? And you touched a bit on it when we were talking about Greece, right?
Mm.
And you find that with the special drawing rights regime, most of those interest rates are calculated based on foreign currencies, like for example, the dollar. That has
Mm-hmm.
nothing to do with some of the, you know, sorry, forgive me, some
Yeah, go
of the
ahead.
local currencies in Africa, right? So that now becomes the question, like, why is debt so expensive to service for African countries? Yes, I just want you to spend some time talking
I mean, I,
about
I would
those.
like to throw that question back to you, but I think so. For me, I listen to you when you say it has nothing to do with the local currency. There's a tendency to want to feel like that. However, I think it does have to do with the local currency, because in as much as we are not a dollarized country in Nigeria or in the whole of Africa, right? But typically most of what we trading is benchmarked to the dollar, because the dollar is a global reserve currency, right? So it has everything to do with what we do. So for me, I think it it's focusing on what we can control, right? Which is some policies that affect institutions, right? That ensure, right, that you are managing your debt. Now, if you're looking at, debt to GDP, debt to revenue, I would say I mean, my best guess is debt to revenue sounds better because it speaks to the sustainability of debt, that you can actually service your debt, because that's, it sort of puts a cap on, on the amount of debt you should be able to get from people who want to lend you money, right? Because it lets them know this is what you earn. Do you understand? And what you earn can change between this year and the next 5 years, right? But whether you focus on debt to revenue instead of debt to GDP, I don't think that's productive in my own take, because what you're dealing with is, forgive me, it's a different kind of beast. You're not dealing with corporate or commercial debt. You're dealing with sovereign debt. If a country decides to default, how are you
Mm-hmm.
getting your money back? Because that if you look at it's just in quick English, it's sovereign, it's free. That's a free country. It doesn't report to anyone. As a human being, at least you report to your state. As a constitution, who does the sovereign nation report to? So how are you getting your funds back? So for me, I think instead of arguing on which is better, I think what we should focus on is the utilization of the debt and the structures that ensure that we manage. For instance, the US debt is astronomical, but the they are, you know, arguably the best country financially in the world. How do we replicate the steps that countries that have come out of the shackle of poverty, sort of like Singapore, China, and the likes, and replicate that? So we are now an exporter of debt, as opposed to, importing debt into the African continent. I think those are the questions we should be focusing on, and trying to sort of nip the problems that we have in the board in terms of why we're having astronomical number of debts and nothing to show for it. I think that's where the conversation should focus on. Does
Mm-hmm.
that make sense? So now I'm throwing the question back to you. So this is no longer interview style, right?
Okay, so what
You,
exactly do
you,
you
you
mean?
asked you asked the question: debt to GDP or debt to revenue, right?
Mm-hmm.
What should we focus on?
I mean, I think, you always, conservatively speaking, you always want to be frugal. Anything that's overdone, it's probably not a good idea. You want to balance your budget, run surpluses, ideally, yeah, ideally balance it or run a surplus, right? And so I don't know if I think debt to GDP should be overly high, but the important thing is that you should have the money to service your debt, right? And you should plan in such a way that whatever you take, you've crunched your numbers, you know the kind of investments that you want to make, and you're able to pay those obligations as at when due, right?
Yes.
And that really brings me to this the next topic I wanted us to focus on, which is like this kind of debt crisis slash distress continuum, and how
Hmm.
countries start getting there. What usually triggers that? For maybe I need to do like a preamble. So debt distress is really when a country sorry, a country has reached a state where it can't afford to pay its debt anymore, then they're in distress, right? And oftentimes that's when they go to the lender of last resort, which is the IMF, right? To help them at this point they're bankrupt. So like, but before becoming bankrupt, there are different steps or different milestones before you in fact reach there. There are signs in your economy that would have been happening. There are different behaviors, which brings me to where we know Ghana is already in distress. Nigeria is crawling there. We saw recently what was happening in Kenya with the finance bill. That's why some of these policies as will be put in place, because there's now a need, because for you to take out some of those loans from the IMF, because they're the lenders of last resort, they start requiring reforms that they believe, technically these reforms are supposed to make you stronger so that you don't have to come back to them. So they're not designed as well. In their conceptualization, they're not meant to be punishment. They're meant to be put in place so that next time you're not in this position. So sometimes it forces some sort of institutional reforms. It asks you to increase your tax base, but there's also a question of where does that tax come from? Does it come from the
Can I just interrupt
okay?
you there a little bit? I know that this is bad etiquette, so I'm sorry for that. But do you know any country that has implemented the steps of the IMF? As a matter of fact, I want to work this. If you're listening to this, just act like I didn't say it. Especially an African country that has come out of the shackles, or the problems that we have as an African country. If there's I mean, apart from maybe Rwanda, but I don't really know if that's due to whatever. But can you point to one African country that has? Because we're speaking about the African continent, right? So for me, I'm asking you this question because I mean, there's a disconnect sometimes with the policies that these institutions put forward, even though, however sound they are economically, right? But there's usually a dislocation in the sense that they don't necessarily have, how do I put it, like a domestic point of view, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
what works in the West might not necessarily work in Africa, because Africa has its different nuances, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can come with something that economically, economics will work with models. It works theoretically in a type of model, but when you bring it to Africa, the nuances are not necessarily factored in from an African perspective. And then you find out that you have these monies that are given out, but you never see the change or the reforms that you expect to see. So I'm asking you the question, right, that you just asked me. It's like I'm throwing it back to you, right? Have you seen a country in Africa where these policies actually bring the desired reforms, apart
I
from
mean,
increasing the debt?
so the question is, and I
Because I'm
could be
asking the
wrong on
questions that
this. No,
I
no, no.
believe
I think.
Africans ask themselves when we're discussing without cameras. We
Mhm.
have the IMF, we have the World Bank. These they come as a knight in shining armor when we need them. But the question is, how many countries have they tried to help that have really come out of the shackles of whatever problems they were having, apart
I
from being
think
able to pay your debts, but to translate into economic prosperity.
so. Most times, that
I'm waiting.
these reforms have been practiced a lot in Latin American countries, right? No, I know. I'm
Mhm.
saying this for a reason because I think historically,
Mhm.
we've been part of something called the heavily indebted poor countries, and
Yeah.
that's when you have like the Paris Club reforms.
Mhm.
I don't know if you remember,
Yeah, I
like I
remember.
think that was started in, I could be wrong, in 1996, and that's when you had stuff like the Nigerian debt cancellation that
Yeah,
happened
of which we're
when
grateful
Obasanjo,
for.
yeah, after,
I said,
yeah,
I said of
and
which we're
then
grateful for.
with that came this embrace of like of free markets and
Yeah.
like privatization. um
Okay.
um so I guess I don't know, it depends on how you look at it. I know that austerity, to be honest, sometimes, yeah, usually when this reprieves come, it's already too late. I think
That's
that's
true.
usually the issue, right? Because for whatever reason, no one is doing anything,
Yeah,
or
but I guess I can't
until.
I can't necessarily blame them for the ineptitude of African leaders, right? They can only
Mhm.
do so much. And like you mentioned, some of the economic reforms, like free trade and some of all these things. We can actually see the benefits of some of all these things. So you give them credit where credit is due, right? But as to, I guess maybe I'm a little bit too ambitious as to believe that some of the reforms you're talking about would lead to a drastic change from being poor and achieving that. In economics, they always tell you have economic convergence, but you never see it. So I guess I was a bit too ambitious. So you can
So
go ahead.
wait, the thing to separate that I'm
Mm.
trying to do is this idea of like the IMF being a lender of last resort and lending you money when you're in
Hmm.
crisis,
Yeah.
versus all these loans that you've taken out
Hmm.
when presumably you're not in crisis and you're managing your economy as you would normally do.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I think so. Tip, and I'm not an
You're speaking
IMF
about the loan
expert.
category. So I'm trying. So
Yeah,
so
yeah,
so
yeah,
let's
yeah.
let's
So
break it
I
down. So
think the question I'm trying to, maybe I didn't understand your question. Are you asking like when they're in distress, have the measures put in place to help, with that, the measures they ask you to, the austerity measures, so to
yes,
speak, that you put in
austerity.
place when you're
Institutional
taking this.
reforms. Like, what country in Africa have you seen that maybe? So I guess it. I'm looking at it from a statistically wrong perspective. They can tell you to do something doesn't necessarily mean you do it, the way they want you to. That's one side of things. Another side of things is the things they tell you to do might not necessarily fit, the African, how will I put it, the African perspective or the African economies. That's another thing. I guess that's the another elephant in the room is the people who are supposed to drive change, which is, the politicians, the government, also have their own agenda, right? So you can't necessarily ask the question, because now I'm thinking about my question. You can't necessarily say, okay, well, they tell us to do all these great, policy reforms, but we never really see the benefit of these policy reforms in terms of a long term view. Of saying yes, we're out. We're now necessarily looking like a Western country from the standpoint of development in terms of deeper financial markets, in terms of better institutions. So that's why I was asking the question. But now I see that the other factors are play, and you can't necessarily ask that question. I guess that's
Mm-hmm.
that's my takeaway from that. Because these
Mm-hmm.
are questions people ask, like, okay, so the IMF, they're here to help, but why does it look like we're not being helped? So that's why I was asking the question. It's policy that see, you can't really take away policy from politics. Do you understand?
Mm-hmm.
So that's really the downside of things. So
Okay. So I like to start. I would like us to end on this. I would like us, as we wrap up, to finally discuss some countries. Like, are there any specific countries that we need to be looking at? Like, talking about, like, you know how, in terms of, like, we've discussed everything from what the debt is, how
yeah,
developing countries are affected with debt, the debt sustainability of these countries,
yeah, we touched on that a little
how,
bit.
yeah, reforms are implemented. Are there any cases that, on your radar, countries to watch in Africa, or anything like that, or
I
anything
mean,
you want us
I
to know
think,
about this?
and I no,
Mhm.
so I'm also because look at Nigeria. I mean, because when if you look at the topic, are we seeing distress, and rightfully so, because initially, in a 10-year period, we borrowed more than $400 billion.
Mhm.
And between that 2020 figure of 775 billion US dollars to 2023, it became 800 and something billion dollars.
Mhm.
So for me, it's like, if you, I like to take away the veil, always follow the money, right? If you ask the question, how are we as a continent paying back? We're not paying back from the proceeds of sound management of debts, which would lead to, um, because we use GDP, we lead to stronger economies, we lead to more jobs, we lead to prosperous nations, and then we now have more money to pay back. We're paying back with the blood, sweat, and tears of the average African on the continent, which is the the resources of the continent. Because if you strip everything, that's what we're paying back with. For me, my concern is, I really don't want to see African countries experiencing a debt trap. Because if you look at the Nigerian figures, and I've been sort of worried about this for a bit, even though I haven't done too much research, but we're having a conversation. So let me see if I can pull up the DMO figures. From the top of my head, it's like 121 trillion naira, which translates to 91 billion US dollars, right? And if you look at debt to GDP from that sense, we are in the range of 50 something percent, which is worrisome, right? But then you also have to ask the question, which I'm sure if you're depending on where you swing politically, right? The reason why this is happening is because of the exchange rate. If the exchange rate is a bit stronger, yeah, wouldn't be hitting. So there is that argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then that's one of the how I put it, this doctors will diagnose and then they look at symptoms. That's one of the symptoms of a debt trap, where you borrow money, but then your currency starts to depreciate because you're finding it hard to pay, and you have economic, how I put it, economic variables that are just not favorable for that country, and you keep on finding it hard to pay. You borrow more, to try and repay back what you owe. Your currency depreciates, and you keep on looking at that, and then you have unsustainable debt levels. Because, like I mentioned, what we really should be focusing on in terms of policy is ensuring strong institutions that will lead to the kind of development that we want, which leads to, for instance, Nigeria, in my own estimation, taking advantage of the young population that we have, the vast land that we have, the natural resources that we have, taking advantage of that, probably making Nigeria a manufacturing base in Africa. Do you understand?
Mm-hmm.
Working with other African countries, because it's the institutions that do that. So for me, it's if you look at the trend, we have an astronomical increase in debt. We're not seeing what the money is used for. We're seeing Ghana default. We're seeing Kenya struggling, and there's a lot of, protests going on, sort of along these lines. And we're seeing Nigeria so you have to ask the question. We also have other countries like Zambia and other countries that are struggling. For me, it's more of a concern. Are we looking at African countries that will sort of enter a debt trap where they will perpetually find it hard to pay back, and the level of debt that we all thought was sustainable is now unsustainable? That for me is where my thought is regarding what you're talking about.
Okay. And I think this brings me to the topic for our next live, which is a particular kind of financial crisis in an economy that is the currency crisis, right? And what that looks like. Because I think, especially talking about exchange rates
Yeah.
um and capital flight, I think there's a whole topic in there about discussing
Wow.
like
Capital
currency
flights.
crisis and
Mhm.
what that all that is about. That's something we should talk about next week, or when we go live next. I think that's like a really rich topic
Yeah,
there.
but before we sort of round up, do we have like anyone around who has questions and things that they like us to sort of talk about?
Well,
I mean, we could take questions because we're live. If there's no question, it's fine. I guess that's the beauty of going live. If there's anyone that
hmm
has a question, we sort of just talk about it, discuss. That's the benefit of this.
hmm
Do we have
uh,
questions?
I guess we don't. So since we don't, well, thank you everyone for listening. It was really a pleasure talking to you, Marcelia, about death and the African continent. I look forward to continuing this series, and and everyone listening in.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Yeah. Bye.